I was standing in my tiny Seattle kitchen, unpacking a box of Christmas lights I'd been meaning to hang for weeks, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. "This year, it's just your brother's family. We don't want any drama." For a moment, I simply stared at the screen, feeling something sharp and familiar sink straight into my chest. Not just uninvited, labeled, once again, as the difficult daughter, the one who always ruins things, the one who must be managed, contained, excluded for everyone's peace. That title has followed me for years. If I expressed how I felt, I was ungrateful. If I set boundaries, I was selfish. If I disagreed, even gently, I was starting something again. Meanwhile, in the family group chat, the plans for Christmas flew back and forth: menus, gift exchanges, matching pajamas, threads of warmth I was never woven into. No one asked where I would be. No one even noticed my silence. I typed back one word, "Okay." And I meant it. Because this year, I wasn't going to sit alone in my cold apartment, pretending it didn't hurt. They still thought I was the same girl they could dismiss with a label. They had no idea I'd sold my tech startup a few months ago for over $100 million. They didn't know I had already created a new family trust, and that this Christmas, I would redefine what the word family meant to me. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been branded as difficult simply because you dared to say no? If you have, tell me where you're listening from. So, I know I'm not alone. When I put my phone down that night and let the silence settle around my apartment, my mind did what it always does. When my family wounds reopen, it drifted back to the town where all of it began. I grew up in a small, sun-bleached patch of Indiana. The kind of place where people waved from porches and knew one another's business before breakfast. Our house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, and from the outside, we looked like the picture-perfect American family. Inside, though, there was an unspoken hierarchy, one my brother Ethan crowned without ever lifting a finger. Ethan was the golden child, and to be fair, he fit the mold with ease. He was agreeable, charming, the kind of boy teachers adored and neighbors praised. He could trip over his own feet and somehow make it look endearing. My parents beamed over every A he brought home. Every small award, every Sunday school compliment about how polite and well-mannered he was. In their eyes, Ethan shined effortlessly. And maybe that was the problem. I was never allowed to shine in the same way. I was different from the beginning, more sensitive, more questioning, more aware of the tiny shifts in tone adults thought children couldn't hear. I could sense favoritism before I had the vocabulary for it. When something felt unfair, I said so, not loudly, not rudely, just honestly. But in our household, honesty wasn't appreciated unless it made other people comfortable. My mother especially disliked discomfort. She used politeness like a shield, using that soft, sugary tone people mistake for kindness to smooth over everything that wasn't perfect. And whenever I pointed out that something wasn't smooth or perfect, she treated me like I was the problem. There's one phrase I can still hear as clearly as if she were standing beside me now. It always came out during family gatherings, when relatives filled our living room with winter coats, casseroles, and gossip. My mother would loop her arm proudly around Ethan and announce, "This is our wonderful son, Ethan." Then, with a half laugh as if shifting to a harmless joke, she'd add, "And this is Lena. She's a little difficult sometimes. But we love her anyway." Everyone would chuckle politely, as if I were a quirky character written into a sitcom for comedic balance. But every time those words hit the air, they lodged themselves a little deeper under my ribs. Difficult. Problematic. An inconvenience wrapped in human skin. I remember one Christmas, in particular Christmas at 13, when the divide between us became undeniable. The tree had been decorated for weeks, covered in glittering ornaments from Ethan's school project, all displayed proudly in front. My contributions, handmade stars cut from cardstock, hung quietly near the back, half hidden behind branches. That morning, Ethan tore through shiny paper to reveal a new gaming console and a bright red mountain bike he'd been begging for. My parents laughed, hugging him as if they'd gifted him the moon. When it was my turn, I unwrapped a small plastic science kit, the kind you'd buy from a discount bin at the drugstore. My mother's voice floated over my shoulder, "Don't make a mess with it, okay? You always scatter things everywhere. The message was clear. Ethan's joy was something to display, mine was something to manage. Later that afternoon, I gently and perhaps naively told my mother it felt unfair. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply said, I wish things were the same for both of us. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. She put down her dish towel, sighed dramatically, and said, "You always have to make everything a big deal, Lena. Why can't you just be happy for your brother? Why can't you ever just be easy?" That was the first time I heard the line that would echo for years. See? This is why we don't invite you to things. You're always so difficult. I learned quickly after that. I learned how to swallow my words before they reached my lips, and how to make myself small at the dinner table so my presence wouldn't tip the room. I learned that speaking up only proved their point, so I stopped speaking. I learned that silence kept the peace even if it crushed me. The more I tried to be agreeable, the tighter that label wrapped around me. If I objected to unfairness, I was dramatic. If I didn't object, I was cold. If I tried to explain myself, I was argumentative. If I withdrew, I was ungrateful. There was no version of me that made sense to them unless I was nodding along, smiling softly, and pretending not to notice the imbalance. Ethan didn't ask for any of this, of course. But he benefited from all of it, floating on a current of parental praise while I treaded water just to stay visible. Looking back now, I realize I was never difficult. I was simply the only one who refused to play along with their carefully curated narrative. And in families like mine, the person who speaks the truth is always framed as the disruptor. That label didn't form overnight. It was shaped over years of small moments, moments that taught me exactly who I was allowed to be and who I wasn't. I wasn't allowed to question. I wasn't allowed to disagree. I wasn't allowed to have needs that inconvenienced anyone. I wasn't allowed to take up space. And slowly, without noticing, I stopped trying. I folded myself into the smallest version of me, just to survive in that house. But the scar it left, the one no one could see, was that I grew up believing something fundamentally wrong about myself, that my instincts were flawed, my emotions were excessive, my perception distorted. I grew up believing that love was conditional, and I had somehow failed to meet the conditions. It would take me years, countless miles away from that town, and a life I built entirely on my own to finally understand the truth buried beneath all their laughter and comments. I wasn't difficult. I was the only one brave enough to notice the imbalance and foolish enough to hope it could change. And that scar, the one carved so deeply throughout my childhood, would shape every chapter that came after. It would follow me to college, into my career, into friendships and relationships, and ultimately lead me to the moment where a single text message, "We don't want any drama," could still make my chest tighten like I was 13 again, holding a cheap science kit no one bothered to wrap properly. By the time I reached senior year of high school, I had already learned to keep my head down and my hopes quiet. But fate, or maybe stubbornness, pushed me towards something bigger than the small Indiana town that had never felt like home. I spent months buried in textbooks, coding late into the night on a borrowed laptop, chasing something I couldn't quite name. When the acceptance letter arrived from Stanford, with a full scholarship in computer science, I felt the air rush out of my lungs. My hands shook as I carried the unopened envelope into the living room, imagining, just for a moment, that my parents might finally look at me with pride that wasn't tinged with criticism. I handed the letter to my father, watching his eyes skim the top lines. I waited for excitement, for surprise, for anything. Instead, he exhaled through his nose and said, "California? That's too far. Why can't you be more like your brother and choose something closer to home? Something practical?" My mother chimed in from the kitchen, barely glancing up. "Stanford is very expensive, isn't it?" I reminded her it was a full scholarship, but she only nodded faintly, as if the fact that I had earned it was secondary to the inconvenience of distance. The moment that should have been life-changing ended with my father switching the TV back on and Ethan walking in, receiving more enthusiasm for his upcoming track meet than I got for getting into one of the best universities in the world. So, I learned. Again, that victories were mine alone to carry. I packed my bags in silence. When I boarded the plane to California, I pressed my forehead to the window as the ground shrank beneath me, feeling both weightless and completely untethered. Stanford was everything my hometown wasn't: sprawling courtyards, glass buildings that reflected the sun like molten silver, people from every corner of the world, and a sense that something extraordinary could happen at any moment. But extraordinary rarely comes without struggle. I didn't have parents wiring me money every month or a family credit card for emergencies. I worked 3 part-time jobs coding small freelance projects, tutoring freshmen in Python, shelving books at the library just to buy books, and pay my share of rent in a cramped student apartment. Some nights I slept on the couch because it was easier than waking my roommates, walking into our shared bedroom at 3 a.m. after finishing a shift. Ramen became dinner more often than I like to admit, and there were weeks when I had to choose between replacing a broken laptop charger or buying groceries. But despite the exhaustion, something inside me lit up. There's something I'd never felt before. I wasn't the difficult daughter at Stanford. I was just Lena, the girl who could debug code in under a minute, the girl who solved optimization problems for fun, the girl professors actually listened to instead of dismissing. My fascination with logistics, how things moved, why they failed, where inefficiencies hid, started with a single lecture on supply chains. I remember staring at the board filled with flow diagrams, thinking, this is the language I've always wanted to speak. Waste, delays, bottlenecks, they were just another form of unfairness that needed someone willing to call them out. I started noticing inefficiencies everywhere: cafeterias running out of supplies, delivery delays, misplaced resources in student labs. The world felt like one giant, messy algorithm waiting to be optimized. With a few friends who lived in the computer lab the way normal students lived in dorms, I began sketching ideas on whiteboards at midnight. We built our first prototype on borrowed equipment, a platform to predict and prevent supply cycle hiccups using machine learning. It barely worked at first, crashing every few hours, misreading data, spitting out impossible routing suggestions, but it was ours. We fixed bugs between classes, rewrote entire sections of code during lunch breaks, and ran simulations until the campus custodians kicked us out at closing time. One evening, running on 3 hours of sleep and far too much instant coffee, I called home, eager to share what we were building. "Mom," I said, unable to hide the excitement in my voice. "My team and I are developing a platform to optimize distribution systems. It could actually help companies reduce waste and delays." There was a pause on the line long enough for my smile to fade. Then she said, "Just don't get involved in anything that causes trouble, okay? Ethan just got a raise, did you hear? We're so proud of him." I stared at my laptop as the line went quiet, realizing with a dull, familiar ache that even from thousands of miles away, the hierarchy was intact. Still, I kept going. Because for the first time in my life, the work itself made me feel like I belonged somewhere. By senior year, our scrappy little project had grown into something real. We signed 2 small local businesses as test clients, just tiny contracts, barely enough to cover API costs, but enough to prove our model worked. I remember walking across campus one winter night, the air sharp with December cold, students laughing and taking photos beneath strings of holiday lights. My phone buzzed with an email confirming our 3rd pilot user. I should have been elated. Instead, I found myself standing alone under a blooming arch of white lights, feeling strangely hollow. Success didn't feel like I thought it would, not when I had no one to share it with. The fireworks from a campus celebration burst overhead, their colors splintering across the sky. Everyone around me cheered. I looked up and wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to have a family who celebrated me with even half that energy. A family who didn't mistake my silence for ingratitude or my ambition for arrogance. A family who didn't call me difficult every time I tried to grow beyond the box they'd forced me into. I didn't know it then, but those quiet nights, those lonely victories were laying the foundation for something much larger, something that would one day change my life completely. But at that moment, I was simply a girl standing in the middle of campus, surrounded by light, feeling both proud and profoundly alone. After graduation, I packed everything I owned into the back of a rental car and drove north to Seattle, the city that felt closest to possibility. I had no real plan, no safety net, just a laptop whose keys were already fading and a prototype that barely functioned outside the Stanford lab. But something inside me, that mixture of stubbornness and hunger that had carried me through childhood and into the Silicon Valley grind, refused to let the idea die. I found a tiny co-working space off South Lake Union that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and I began rebuilding the platform from scratch. I lived cheaply, renting a room in a creaky old house with mismatched furniture and drafty windows. My bank account was a constant source of anxiety. Every time I refreshed it, the number felt more like a countdown than a balance. Within a few months, I hired 2 engineers, brilliant, underpaid, and equally desperate to prove themselves. We worked from morning until past midnight, eating energy bars for meals and warming our hands over space heaters when the building's heating system failed. Money evaporated faster than I expected. Server costs ballooned. Data fees surged. There were days when I had to choose between paying my engineers on time or paying myself, and I always chose them. Eventually, the company account dwindled to just a few $100s. I remember staring at the numbers late one night, the screen casting a cold glow on my face, thinking, this might be it. This might be where everything ends. But endings have a strange way of becoming beginnings. That same week, I managed to secure a meeting with the operations director of a regional hospital network. I spent 3 days rewriting the pitch deck, rehearsing every sentence until I could deliver it even half asleep. When the day finally arrived, I stood in a glass conference room, my hands slightly shaking as I clicked through the slides. At the end of the pitch, the director leaned back, tapped his pen on the table, and said, "Let's run a trial." Those 4 words felt like oxygen in my lungs. The contract wasn't big, it wouldn't make us rich or even comfortable, but it bought us time. And time was all we needed. The pilot succeeded faster than I dared hope. Our predictions helped the hospital prevent a week-long supply delay during a critical flu surge. Word spread. A small chain of clinics reached out next, then a handful of medium-sized distributors. Our platform began to evolve, almost like a living organism, smarter, faster, more efficient with every update. For the first time in my life, something I built was being seen, used, validated. And then, the world shifted. The supply chain crisis hit like a global shockwave. Delays piled on delays, warehouses overflowed, and hospitals ran dangerously low on essentials. Suddenly, everyone was desperate for a solution, any solution. Our platform, once just a small tool used by a few early adopters, became something much larger, a lifeline. Companies that had ignored my cold emails 6 months earlier were now calling nonstop, begging for demos. The stress was overwhelming, the pressure unbelievable, but for the first time, the world needed something only we could provide. Journalists started reaching out. One article called us the nervous system of American logistics. Another placed me on a 30 under 30 list with a photo taken in my cramped office, cables snaking behind me like an accidental metaphor. Investors appeared from every direction, offering funding, partnerships, acquisitions. I barely had time to process any of it. I worked until my vision blurred and my coffee went cold beside me, and still it didn't feel like enough. But we were surviving. Thriving, even. Then came the offer, the kind of offer founders whisper about in hallways and dream about when they're exhausted beyond reason. A Fortune 500 conglomerate wanted to buy the company outright. The number was staggering, somewhere between $110 and $150 million, depending on performance clauses and equity calculations. When I first heard the figure, I couldn't speak. My team celebrated in the only way we knew how, ordering takeout and popping a bottle of cheap champagne someone had forgotten in the office fridge. And when the lawyers finalized the paperwork, when my signature dried on the last page, I stepped outside the building into the sharp Seattle winter. The wind stung my cheeks as I looked up at the gray sky and realized, for the first time in my life, I didn't have to fear rent. I didn't have to fear bills. I didn't have to fear survival. But success doesn't erase scars, it only throws them into sharper relief. A month after the acquisition, I drove back to Indiana for Thanksgiving, part curiosity, part naive hope that maybe this time, news of my success would mean something. I arrived with gifts, a soft cashmere scarf for my mother, a leather wallet for my father, And for my grandmother, the only person who had ever truly seen me a full health assessment package at one of the top clinics in Indianapolis. She cried when she opened it. My parents didn't. Dinner was loud and chaotic, filled with the same stories I'd heard for years. Ethan had just bought a new house. Ethan had been promoted. Ethan had been praised by his boss. "Your brother is doing so well," my father said proudly, carving the turkey with ceremony. I waited for a pause, waited for space to share my own news. "Finally," I said softly, "I actually sold my company." My mother blinked, confused. "What company?" "My startup," I clarified. "The one I've been working on for years. It was acquired." My father gave a dismissive laugh, the same laugh he used when servers explained unfamiliar dishes at restaurants. "All that tech stuff is too complicated. I don't keep up with it. Anyway, did you hear about your brother's new contract? It's huge." Ethan grinned modestly while the conversation returned to him, the spotlight snapping right back to its default setting. I sat there, surrounded by a family that knew everything about my brother and almost nothing about me. A family that didn't ask a single follow-up question. A family that dismissed a life-changing achievement with the same ease they dismissed my childhood feelings. And in that moment, I understood something with a clarity that stung. No amount of success could make me visible to people who had chosen not to see me. I wasn't their difficult daughter because I had ever done something wrong. I was their difficult daughter because I didn't fit the story they preferred, one where Ethan was the golden child and I was the complication. And even standing there, financially secure in a way few people ever experience, I still felt like that little girl holding a discount science kit no one wanted to wrap properly. When I returned to my apartment in Seattle after that Thanksgiving trip, a trip that should have felt like a victory lap, but instead felt like running straight into a wall, the silence inside my home wrapped around me like a cold sheet. I tried to bury myself in work, in planning, in anything that made me feel more grounded than the hollow disappointment still circling my chest. But when my mother's Christmas message arrived, "This year, it's just your brother's family. We don't want any drama," I realized something ugly had been festering beneath the surface for years, maybe decades. And for the first time, I questioned it. Was it just me they wanted to exclude? Or was I simply the easiest one to blame? The thought lingered like a shadow. If they were willing to cut me out so bluntly, so casually, maybe this wasn't an isolated decision. Maybe it wasn't a sudden irritation. Maybe they had been quietly pruning the family tree for years, removing people who didn't fit the image they wanted to project, people who didn't orbit around Ethan's glow. I needed to know the truth. So I called the one person whose voice always soothed the storm inside me, my grandmother. She picked up on the third ring, her tone warm as always. "Sweetheart, everything all right?" I forced my voice to sound casual. "Just checking in. Are we seeing each other this year? Are you going to Mom and Dad's for Christmas, or staying with Uncle James?" There was a pause. A soft, resigned sigh drifted through the speaker. "Oh, honey. I'm not going anywhere this year." She tried to sound cheerful, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "Your parents said they wanted to keep it simple. Just your brother and his family. They said a small Christmas would be easier." A short, brittle laugh. "I'm used to it by now. It's Herr Fran." Her words hit me harder than my mother's message. Grandma excluded? The woman who had held our family together through illnesses, moves, crises? The woman who had never missed a holiday, a birthday, a piano recital? The woman who had sewn Ethan's Halloween costumes and baked me chocolate chip cookies when I cried in her kitchen? She wasn't invited either. The realization chilled me. I swallowed. "Did they explain why?" "Oh, you know your mother." Grandma's voice softened. "She said they were tired. That it was too much to host everyone. But somehow, it's never too much when it's your brother and his kids." She hesitated. "Don't worry about me, sweetheart. I'll be fine with a little tea and a good book." But I wasn't fine. My hands trembled around the phone. If excluding me had hurt, excluding Grandma felt like betrayal in its purest form. After I hung up, I sat still for a long time, long enough for the winter light to shift across my floor. Something inside me cracked, not loudly like glass, but slowly, like ice melting into water. It wasn't just me. It was anyone who wasn't convenient. Anyone who didn't fit the perfect holiday picture my parents curated. To be sure, I began calling others one by one, almost mechanically. My aunt in Ohio, my uncle in Kentucky, my cousins scattered across Chicago, Phoenix, Denver. Each call unraveled another thread in the family fabric. Most hadn't been invited this year. Some hadn't been invited for years. Not because of distance, not because of work, but because they had grown tired of my parents' expectations, rules, judgments, and endless comparisons. And the story was always the same. They blamed me for anything awkward. They blamed me for tension. They had painted me as the family problem so convincingly that even relatives who barely saw me assumed it must be true. She's dramatic. She overreacts. She's difficult. Admit it doesn't. She always turns a small issue into something big. She's the reason gatherings feel uncomfortable. Hearing these things repeated casually, almost as fact, felt like watching my childhood play out again, except this time spoken through the voices of adults who didn't even know me. They only knew the version my parents told them. One cousin admitted quietly, "We didn't want to take sides. Your mom made it sound like you were explosive." I was slowed. Another said, "Honestly, I didn't know what to believe. We barely saw you, because you were always studying or working." And then, one that cut the deepest, "We didn't think you wanted to come anyway." I thanked them politely, hung up, and stared at the wall. They erased me so subtly that even I started to believe it. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern, a long, carefully maintained pattern where Ethan shone, where my parents' favorite narratives thrived, and where anyone who didn't play along was quietly pushed aside. People weren't avoiding me because I was dramatic. They avoided me because my parents had told them I was. They avoided me because I had spoken truths no one wanted to acknowledge. I had pointed out favoritism. I had asked for fairness. I had asked for emotional accountability. I had asked not to be invisible. And in families like mine, that made me difficult. That made me the scapegoat. When I finally put the phone down, my apartment was silent again, but this time the silence wasn't cold, it was clarifying. For the first time in 30 years, I understood something I had never been willing to articulate. My family wasn't cruel by accident. They were cruel by choice. They protected convenience over connection, appearance over honesty, Ethan's comfort over everyone else's truth. And anyone who dared disturb that equilibrium, even gently, was branded the problem. It hurt, God, it hurt. But pain is sometimes a compass. And right then, mine swung sharply toward a new direction. If they wanted a Christmas without drama, fine. Then I would create one. But it would be a Christmas built on truth. On love freely given, not demanded. On connection, not control. On people who showed up, not people who showed off. And as I sat there with all the puzzle pieces finally aligning, one realization rose like a quiet, steady flame. I wasn't the problem. I was simply the first one who refused to stay silent. And this year, I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. After the last call ended and the truth finally settled, the heavy, undeniable truth that it wasn't just me who'd been cut out, but Grandma too, I sat alone on my couch, the room illuminated only by the fading gray light of Seattle's winter. My phone lay face down beside me. Not even the quiet hum of traffic could drown out the echo of Grandma's resigned voice. I wasn't invited. I'm used to it. Used to it. Those words wouldn't stop replaying in my head. For a moment, I pressed my palms against my eyes, feeling a hot sting that wasn't quite tears, but something deeper, a mix of anger, grief, and clarity. Grandma had never asked for anything. Not love. Not attention. Not gifts. She had never demanded to be the center of a room. She had simply shown up. For everyone. For me, especially for me. And she was used to being ignored. I sat up slowly, wiped my face, and glanced at the bookshelf where I kept my documents. Then at the drawer where my passport was tucked away. Then finally at my laptop. 3 objects. 3 possibilities. 3 reminders that my life had changed in ways my parents neither knew nor cared to understand. I inhaled once. Deeply. Then I opened my laptop. There it was, my bank account, glowing with more zeros than I ever imagined I'd see in my lifetime. Money that had come from years of sleepless nights, coding until my fingers cramped, convincing clients while I was barely able to pay rent. Money that no one in my family had lifted a finger to help me earn. Money that had given me freedom. Freedom to choose. Freedom to protect. Freedom to rewrite the story. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I whispered to myself, "Let's give Grandma the Christmas she's never had." Then I opened another tab and searched, "Flights to Paris, December 22nd. A surreal calm washed over me as I clicked through the options. First-class seats. Non-stop flight. A hotel overlooking the Seine, a private balcony. Enough warmth and beauty to erase years of cold Christmases. For once, I wouldn't be fighting for a place at someone else's table. I would create my own. And I would bring the one person who deserved that place more than anyone. Grandma was going to Paris. Before booking the tickets, though, there was something else, something deeper, heavier, more symbolic that I'd been putting off for weeks. My family trust. After the acquisition, my attorney had advised me to establish a trust for asset protection. At the time, even though I knew my parents didn't fully see me, I still included them: Dad, Mom, Ethan, because that's what good daughters do. The beneficiaries list had been a careful mixture. My parents, my brother, my grandmother, a few cousins I grew up with, and a percentage allocated for scholarships for young women in tech. Back then, the trust had felt like a promise. A way to give back, a way to protect the people connected to my story. But now? Now it felt like a lie. How could I leave millions to people who wouldn't even leave me a seat at the Christmas table? People who hadn't included Grandma either? People who smiled for neighbors, praised Ethan endlessly, and swept every cruelty under a rug labeled family unity? No. Not anymore. The uninvited message wasn't just a slight, it was the final confirmation that they had made their choices long ago, and now, I would make mine. I scheduled a meeting with my attorney the next morning. His office was a sleek glass building downtown, overlooking Elliott Bay. As I sat across from him, the city below seemed strangely quiet, almost suspended. He pushed his glasses up and scanned the old trust documents, then looked at me with mild surprise. "So you want to amend this to remove your parents and your brother?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "Completely." He hesitated. "This is a significant change. Just to be clear, you understand that once their names are out, they're out forever." I finished for him. "I understand. And you're sure this is what you want?" I thought of Grandma sitting alone on Christmas. I thought of every dismissal, every eye roll, every comparison, every "don't start," every "you're overreacting," every "why can't you be more like Ethan?" I thought of being 13 with a cheap science kit while Ethan got a bicycle and a brand new gaming console. I thought of calling home from Stanford to share good news, only to be told, "Don't cause trouble. Your brother just got a raise." "Yes," I said softly. "I'm sure." He nodded and began typing. For the next hour, we rewrote the trust from the ground up. Grandma remained the primary beneficiary. 2 cousins who had always treated me with kindness were added. A philanthropic fund for children who grew up as scapegoats in dysfunctional families was established. A scholarship for young women who wanted to study logistics and computer science was expanded. And finally, quietly, decisively, the names of my parents and Ethan were removed. Their erasure from the trust felt like a moral release, almost like setting down a weight I had carried since childhood. Not revenge. Not spite. Just freedom. Boundaries in legal form. When the attorney printed the final documents for signature, the pages felt heavier than paper, like a declaration, like a rebalancing of something that had been wrong for a long time. I signed my name. Ink drying on a new future. On the Uber ride home, the December rain slid across the window like silver threads. I held the folder in my lap, running my thumb along its edge. My phone buzzed with holiday ads and travel discounts. The city lights flickered against the water. And all I could think was, Grandma deserves the world. And I finally have the power to give her a piece of it. That evening, I booked everything. The flights, the hotel, a Christmas Eve dinner cruise on the Seine, a private tour of the Louvre, a room with a view of the Eiffel Tower. And then, Once everything was said, I sat down to craft the final step of my plan, a step that wasn't meant to humiliate anyone, but simply to show the truth. On Christmas Eve, while my parents and Ethan sat in their curated version of family, I would send one message into the family group chat. Merry Christmas from Paris. Grandma and I have an announcement. Then we would go live. In front of the Eiffel Tower. With the trust documents in hand. With Grandma beside me, finally seen. And the people who had pushed us aside would learn, in real time, that the story they had written was no longer the one I was living. This time, I wasn't the difficult daughter. I was the daughter who chose herself and chose the one person who had always chosen me. Paris in December looked like it had been dipped in gold. The moment Grandma and I stepped out of the taxi on the Champs-Élysées, the world shimmered with warm amber lights strung across rows of winter trees. The air carried a soft bite, the kind that stings your cheeks but also makes every breath feel clean and new. Street vendors roasted chestnuts on the sidewalk, the smell drifting through the cold air like a warm memory. Bells rang from a distant cathedral, their echoes floating above the city, as if the rooftops themselves were humming. Paris didn't just shine, it glowed. It felt like the universe had opened a door and let us step into a dream. Grandma clutched her wool coat a little tighter, her eyes wide like a child's. "Oh my," she whispered as the Eiffel Tower sparkled in the distance. "It's real. It's Hive." I watched her, not the lights. That expression, the wonder, the disbelief, the quiet joy was something I had never seen on her face before. It was worth more than anything in my bank account. But the true beginning of this Paris chapter wasn't the sparkling avenue or the glittering tower. It began on the airplane. When we boarded the international flight, Grandma's hands shook just slightly as she ran her fingers over the wide first-class seat. "Lord have mercy," she muttered, almost afraid to sit. "I feel like I'm trespassing." "You're not trespassing, Grandma." I laughed, fastening her seatbelt for her. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." She gripped my hand tightly as the engines roared. "I've never been on a plane going out of the country," she confessed. "Your mother always said she needed me home for the holidays, so I stayed. Every year." She paused. "Even when no one really needed me." I squeezed her fingers. "Grandma, who told you we were drama?" She finally looked at me, her eyes soft. "Your mom," she admitted. "And a few others. They said you always stirred things up. But I never believed it. I just thought you were honest. And honesty scares people who prefer things quiet." The plane lifted into the sky, and she sucked in a breath, clutching my hand harder. I leaned closer and whispered, "Then this trip is our reward for telling the truth." Her shoulders loosened. She let out a shaky laugh, rested her head back, and for the first time in years, I saw her settle into comfort, not duty, not obligation, not pretense. Just comfort. Paris the next morning was all silver sky and soft wind swirling around the Seine. We walked side by side along the riverbank, our scarves wrapped tightly, our fingers dipping into pockets for warmth. Christmas markets lined the bridges like tiny villages made of light gingerbread stands. Handmade candles, watercolor artists, musicians playing violins that seemed to sing directly into the cold air. As we neared the Eiffel Tower, its iron lattice looming like a crown over the city, Grandma slowed down. She stared up with an expression I could only describe as awe mixed with grief. Not heavy grief, quiet grief. The kind that comes from remembering a life lived small, because circumstances forced it. "I always wanted to see this," she murmured. "When I was young, I dreamed of traveling. But there was always someone who needed something. First, my parents. Then your mother. Then your brother. There was never time for me." There it was, a mirror to my own scars, just etched into an older face. Generations of women in my family had lived lives shaped by obligation, not aspiration. "You deserved more," I said softly. She didn't argue. She just leaned her head on my shoulder for a moment as tourists bustled around us. A little later, as we sat on a bench at the base of the tower with hot chocolate warming our hands, she spoke again. "I see it now," she whispered. "They didn't treat you badly because you were difficult. They treated you badly because you reminded them of everything they didn't want to face." I blinked, startled. What do you mean? You told the truth, she said simply. You asked for fairness. You asked for respect. Women in this family were never allowed to ask for things. You broke the pattern. They punished you for it. Her words felt like a key turning inside a lock I hadn't realized was closed. On Christmas Eve, we returned to our small hotel near the Latin Quarter, a charming place with creaking wooden floors, a wrought iron balcony, and a view of the city that looked like a painting. The sky was a deep navy, dotted with tiny stars, and the sound of distant music drifted through the chilly air. Grandma made us tea from the little kettle in the room, and we sat together on the balcony wrapped in blankets. The city glowed beneath us like an ocean of light. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, the revised family trust. Grandma, I said softly, there's something I need to show you. Her brows knit in confusion as she watched me open the folder and spread the documents on the small balcony table. This is my family trust, I explained. I set it up after the acquisition. Originally, I included Mom, Dad, and Ethan. And you, of course. In next in Ferdy. She looked down at the list of names, realizing her own sat at the top. But after everything that happened, I changed it. I walked her through it slowly. She remained the primary beneficiary. The cousins who had shown kindness over the years were included. The educational fund was expanded. A new fund for children who grew up as scapegoats, kids like I once was, had been added. And them? She whispered. They're out, I said quietly. Her eyes flicked to mine, searching for whether this was bitterness or freedom. Honey, are you sure? They'll be furious. They'll say awful things. I know. I breathed in, letting the Paris wind fill my lungs. But I'm not doing this to make them angry. I'm doing it so I stop being used, so I stop being the one who gets punished for speaking up. And I'm doing it to protect you. From them. And from the years you spent putting yourself last. And now her wish is our day. She sniffed, blinked hard, then wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. You didn't have to do this for me, she whispered. I reached for her hand. You're the only one who ever chose me. I'm choosing you back. A long silence followed, gentle, not heavy. She squeezed my fingers, her voice trembling but steady. Then let this be their lesson, she said softly. Not out of anger, but out of truth. Below us, the city bells began to ring. And for the first time in my life, Christmas didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a beginning. Christmas night in Paris arrived soft and silver, as though the sky itself had been dusted with frost. From the balcony of our small hotel, the Eiffel Tower glowed like a golden spine against the dark, shimmering with its hourly sparkle. The city below bustled with holiday laughter, families clinking glasses inside warm restaurants, children pulling scarves tighter as they chased each other down lamplit streets. Behind me, Grandma adjusted her shawl, smoothing the edges with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from anticipation. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in that familiar house in Indiana, my family had gathered around the Christmas table. I could picture it perfectly. The same heavy wooden dining table polished for guests, the same oversized red and gold ornaments dangling from the tree, the same matching pajamas they bought each year for Ethan's kids, the embroidered fay lay pillows on the couch. And, of course, the same dynamic. The group chat currently buzzing was filled with photos of presents, wine glasses raised mid-toast, and inside jokes exchanged between my parents, my brother, and his wife. And, as always, my name wasn't mentioned once. I might as well have been a ghost. But tonight, I wasn't staying silent. Tonight, I was stepping into the frame. I opened the group chat and typed a single line, "Merry Christmas from Paris. Join the video call." Then I sent a link. Within seconds, the typing bubble appeared. My brother responded first. "Paris?" My mother followed with a curt, "What are you doing there?" But they joined anyway, curiosity, suspicion, and jealousy packaged neatly into one click. Their faces popped onto the screen, the camera pointed toward the dining table. My brother's kids were half eating, half staring. My sister-in-law frowned, whispering something. My father leaned back slightly as though preparing for a performance he didn't yet understand. My mother squinted into the camera with that familiar mixture of concern and judgment. But the moment they saw Grandma beside me, her shawl blowing gently in the Paris wind, the Eiffel Tower glittering behind us, everything shifted. My mother gasped. You took my mother to Paris? Why didn't you tell us?" Her voice tried to sound wounded, but the sharp edge of envy sliced right through. My brother let out a laugh, shaking his head. "Wow. Difficult daughter went big this year. To 7. I refused to let their tone pull me back into old patterns. I kept my voice steady, almost calm. "I just wanted to wish everyone a Merry Christmas," I said. "And I wanted to share something important. Something about the future." My father's eyes narrowed. "What kind of future?" I reached for the folder on the small balcony table. The wind lifted the corner of the papers as though Paris itself wanted to reveal them. I held the documents up to the camera so they could see the embossed law firm logo, the signatures, the notary stamp, every legal detail, crisp and undeniable. "I created a family trust," I said. "A few months after the acquisition." My mother blinked, confused. "Acquisition of what?" "My company," I replied evenly. "The one I built." I paused for a beat. "The one I sold." That quick flicker in their eyes, shock mixed with disbelief, was almost poetic. "I started this trust," I continued, "because I wanted to protect the people who have truly acted like family. And because you've always called me dramatic, I figured, maybe it's time I choose what kind of drama I show up for." My brother rolled his eyes. "Here we go." But Grandma straightened her back beside me, her posture regal in the glow of Parisian lights. She wasn't afraid. I began reading the first page, each name spoken clearly. Intentionally. Grandma. A few cousins who had been kind over the years. An educational fund for young girls in tech. And the new fund, one for children growing up in toxic households, carrying scars like mine. I could see my mother's impatience brewing. "Get to the point," she snapped. "What does any of this have to do with us?" I turned to the final section. "There is one more part," I said. "The list of those who are no longer beneficiaries." The dining room quieted instantly. My father leaned forward. "What are you implying?" I inhaled softly, letting the city's cold air steal me. "Effective immediately," I said. "Mom. Dad. Ethan, you are no longer included in the trust." For a moment, there was silence. Beautiful, suspended silence. Then, my mother exploded. "You can't do that. That money belongs to the family." I lifted an eyebrow. "It belongs to me. I earned it." "You owe us," she snapped. "We raised you." You raised me?" The words came out before I could stop them, a soft disbelief coloring my tone. "You dismissed me. You belittled me. You excluded me for years. That's not raising. That's surviving each other." My father tried to regain control, the voice of reason tone he always used when manipulating. "You're acting out of emotion. You should speak to us privately, not embarrass the family like this." Before I could answer, Grandma stepped forward into the camera frame. Her voice was surprisingly strong. "No," she said. "She's not embarrassing the family. She's telling the truth. And it's about time someone did." My mother froze. "Mother." But Grandma cut her off. "I've watched you treat her like a burden since she was a child. Calling her difficult, dismissing her feelings, praising Ethan no matter what he did. You created this dynamic, not her." My father opened his mouth, but Grandma slammed the verbal door shut before he could speak. "She isn't punishing you. She's protecting herself. And protecting me, and that is something you never did." The dining room went silent again. This time, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a truth too big to argue with. I stepped back beside Grandma, letting her words settle like snow. Then I took a breath and said the last thing I needed to say. "I'm not stopping any of you from having a Merry Christmas. Truly. I'm simply choosing not to let my future and my resources be tied to people who have spent years calling me the problem." I held my gaze steady. "From now on, my money supports the people who act like family, not just the people who share my last name." The Eiffel Tower sparkled behind us as though punctuating the moment. And for the first time in my life, I watched my family fall silent, not because they won, but because they had finally been confronted with the truth they spent 30 years avoiding. The moment I ended the call, Paris fell quiet around me in a way that felt almost unreal. The Eiffel Tower continued to shimmer in the distance. Tourists below laughed and posed for photos. A street musician played a slow jazz tune on his saxophone, but none of that softened the vibration that began buzzing urgently in my pocket. My phone lit up like a warning flare. First came my mother. Then my father. Then Ethan. Then an aunt. Then a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, one who had always aligned herself tightly with my parents. The notifications stacked so fast the screen froze for a second before catching up, as if even the device was overwhelmed by the flood. I didn't answer. I just stood there on the balcony, the wind brushing stubborn strands of hair across my face, watching my phone vibrate on the table as though it were trying to crawl toward me. Grandma had gone to lie down shortly after the call ended, exhausted from the day and from the confrontation. I didn't want the noise to disturb her, so I stepped back inside, closed the sliding door gently behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed. Only then did I unlock my phone. The messages were exactly what I expected, and yet, somehow, even sharper than I remembered from childhood. My mother's first text read like a shout trapped inside a paragraph. "How could you humiliate us like that? On Christmas? You've always been dramatic, but this is a new level. I barely recognize you anymore. RN2. My father's message came next, measured but dripping with disappointment. Your behavior tonight was completely unnecessary. We raised you better than this. You're acting out of emotion. Take some time to think before you ruin this family permanently." Ethan's texts followed 3 in a row, each one more mocking than the last. "Congrats, you officially lost it. Taking grandma doesn't make you a hero. Money clearly went to your head. No mine." Then came the extended relatives, the ones who faithfully echoed my parents' perspective. "Your mother is devastated. You owe your father an apology. You're acting like a spoiled brat. You've changed since you got rich. You didn't need to make a scene in front of the whole family." And the most manipulative of them all, from an aunt who hadn't bothered to send me a birthday message in over a decade. "Sweetie, you're tearing this family apart over feelings. You need to calm down and fix this." I sat with the phone glowing in my lap, message after message painting me as the villain. It felt familiar, too familiar. Like slipping into a coat I had outgrown, but had once worn every day. But this time, something was different. The sting didn't land the same way. Their words didn't burrow under my ribs like they used to. Because tonight, I had spoken the truth out loud, and the truth had echoed louder than their denial ever could. As I scrolled, another notification banner appeared, this one from a different chat group. A smaller, quieter group, one I had almost forgotten existed. My cousins. The ones who had, over the years, quietly pulled away from the family gatherings. The ones whose absences were always explained away by my mother as, "They're just busy," or "They don't care about family traditions like we do." But now, message after message appeared. I saw the call. "Thank you. I always thought it was just me. That I was the only problem child. Your parents treated us the same way when we tried to speak up. Thank you for protecting grandma. She deserves so much better. You weren't dramatic. You were brave." I blinked at the screen. Some messages were from cousins I hadn't spoken to since high school. Others from relatives who had always seemed distant, neutral, or uninterested. But now, they were writing paragraphs full, vulnerable paragraphs about their own experiences, their own scars, their own quiet exits from the family system. I leaned back slowly, letting the weight of their honesty settle like a warm blanket over my shoulders. For so long, I truly believed I had been the only one living under the label difficult. Because that was the power of the family narrative. It isolated its target until the target believed the story too. But now, the truth shimmered through the cracks. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. I had just been the only one who hadn't walked away yet. When the messages slowed, I finally placed the phone face down on the nightstand. The room was dim, quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. Across the room, Grandma slept curled on her side, the soft rise and fall of her breath steady and peaceful. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, the rooftops, the river, the glowing horizon. Paris didn't judge me. Paris didn't call me dramatic. Paris didn't try to rewrite my reality. Standing there, wrapped in the hush of a foreign city, I whispered the words I had never dared to say. I was never the difficult daughter. I was the daughter who wouldn't let them walk all over me. It felt like a truth that had been waiting decades to be spoken. My chest loosened. My mind quieted. The weight I had carried for so long, years of doubt, self-blame, and guilt, shifted. I realized I wasn't at a low point, even though the confrontation had been intense and painful. This was a different kind of bottom. Not the collapsing kind, but the grounding kind. A bottom where you finally see the floor clearly. A bottom where clarity settles in like the first snowfall. A bottom that marks the end of an old story, not the failure of a new one. I felt isolated, yes. Cut off from the family I grew up with, yes. But I didn't feel wrong. For the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel wrong. And that was the quiet, powerful difference. Tomorrow, the world would keep spinning. My parents would keep calling. My brother would keep sending snide comments. The relatives who sided with them would write long paragraphs about how family means forgiveness. But tonight, in a small Paris hotel room with my grandmother sleeping peacefully across from me, I finally understood something. Being called difficult was never the problem. Allowing them to define me by that word that had been the problem. Now, I wasn't letting them define anything anymore. By the time I returned to Seattle, a couple of weeks after Paris, the city was in that quiet winter lull where the holidays had passed, but the snow still clung to the sidewalks, like it had nowhere else to be. My apartment felt different now, lighter, as though some invisible weight I didn't even know I had been carrying had slipped off somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. For a few days, I tried to settle back into a rhythm. I unpacked, I checked in on a few founders I was advising. I even took Grandma to her follow-up appointments and helped her hang the framed photo we took in front of the Eiffel Tower. But despite the peace I was cultivating, my phone kept lighting up with missed calls from my parents. Eventually, the messages shifted from anger to something resembling concern, or rather, their version of concern. We need to talk. Not like that, not on a group call. This needs to be handled properly. High-dender spreaded 9. Finally, one message came through from my father that stopped me mid-step. We want to have a calm, adult conversation. In person or over video. Your choice. Calm. Adult. Those were words he rarely used when speaking to me. Under normal circumstances, our family solved conflict by pretending nothing happened until everyone could plaster on the usual smiles. But this they couldn't ignore. Money had been involved, and their pride. Two things they cared about with religious devotion. So I agreed to meet. We chose a neutral cafe downtown, quiet, gray brick walls, Edison bulbs glowing in warm puddles of light, the kind of place where people whispered rather than spoke. I arrived first, ordered a tea, and watched cars pass outside as the steam curled into the air. When they walked in, I recognized the look instantly, a blend of wounded pride and tightly controlled indignation. My mother carried herself as though the entire cafe might be watching her, and my father's jaw was set firm like he was bracing for impact. They sat. We exchanged stiff greetings. And then it began. My mother leaned in first, her voice soft but her words sharpened like glass. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Why make a spectacle in front of the whole family? You humiliated us." I didn't flinch. "I didn't humiliate you. I told the truth." My father folded his hands on the table. "We are family. Family matters should stay private. You should have spoken to us before making such drastic decisions. Money should stay within the family line. Money should stay with the people who acted like family," I corrected quietly. He exhaled. "You know that's not what we meant." My mother shook her head. "You've changed so much since selling your company. You behave like you're above us." There it was, the accusation I knew would surface eventually. It always did. The implication that my independence was arrogance, that my boundaries were disrespect, that my success was somehow an insult to them. I let the silence breathe for a moment before speaking. "Do you know how many Christmases I spent sitting on the stairs or in my room because there weren't enough chairs at the table? Do you remember how many times you told me I was too emotional, too sensitive, Too difficult, whenever I asked for the same respect you gave Ethan? My mother stiffened. That's not fair. It's not fair, I repeated, not raising my voice but letting the weight land. When I got into Stanford, Dad told me it was too far. When I called home excited about my project in college, you moved the conversation back to Ethan's promotion. When I tried to set boundaries, you called me selfish. When you uninvited me from Christmas this year, you didn't even hesitate. My father's expression faltered, just a flicker. We didn't realize it hurt you that much. You didn't want to realize, I said gently. It was easier to pretend I was the problem than to face how you treated me. My mother's eyes glossed with tears, not understanding tears, but defensive ones, the kind she cried when her image was threatened. We didn't mean for things to get so deep, she whispered. I nodded slowly. I don't think you did. I don't think you ever sat down and said, let's hurt her. But you still did. And the trust isn't revenge, it's a boundary. My future deserves protection from the dynamics that have hurt me my entire life. The silence that followed was long and strangely fragile. My father finally broke it with a sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I didn't realize how far things had gone. How long you carried this? I carried it because you left it on me, I answered. But I'm done carrying it now. My mother reached out a hand, hesitated, then lowered it again. So that's it? We're cut out forever? No, I said softly. Not forever. But until you can talk to me without calling me the problem. Without labeling me as dramatic or difficult. Without rewriting the past every time I try to speak. She looked away. My father stared at the table. I continued, if you ever want a relationship based on respect, I'm here. But I won't go back to the old dynamic. I won't shrink to make anyone comfortable again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was not an apology, they weren't ready for that. And I didn't force it, people can only meet you at the depth they've reached themselves. But something had shifted, if only slightly. My father finally whispered, I don't want to lose you. I nodded, then learn how to see me. And that was the closest we got to reconciliation. Not a warm embrace. Not forgiveness wrapped in a bow. Just a quiet pause, a space created between us where truth could exist without being suffocated. When we left the cafe, we walked in separate directions. The winter air felt cold on my cheeks, but not harsh. Not painful. It felt like a boundary settling into place, a clean line drawn after decades of blurred ones. And for the first time ever, that line didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a door, one they could choose to walk through someday. But only if they learned how to knock. 6 months passed with a gentleness I hadn't known in years. Maybe ever. Seattle thawed from winter into a soft, rainy spring. And in that time, my life settled into something that finally felt like my own. The old heaviness, the constant fear of being blamed, misunderstood, or dismissed no longer lived in my chest. Instead, there was space. Quiet, steady space. Grandma was the heart of that peace. She thrived. Surgeries she had postponed for years were now covered and handled. Her medications were organized, her specialists coordinated, her life finally supported rather than stretched thin. Sometimes, she took short weekend trips with a group of retired teachers, little adventures she never allowed herself before. She would return with photos of lighthouses in Oregon, lavender fields in northern Washington, or homemade fudge from a tiny coastal shop. Every time, she'd tell me the same thing. I didn't know life could be this light. Add. And every time, I'd think. Neither did I. As for me, I didn't step away from tech. I stepped deeper into it, but in my own way this time. I became an angel investor for women founders whose ideas were often overlooked simply because they weren't loud or connected or born into the right families. Young women who reminded me of myself at 21. Brilliant, determined, and misread. I mentored them. I taught them how to raise capital, negotiate equity, and survive boardrooms filled with people who underestimated them. I helped them build the kind of company I once wished I had won with support, not skepticism. And in between meetings, I worked quietly with a nonprofit that supported kids growing up in toxic homes. Children labeled problematic, when really, they were simply visible. The trust I created funded therapy scholarships, mentorship programs, and emergency grants that helped young people leave abusive living situations sooner than I ever could. It felt like stitching new fabric across old wounds, not to hide them, but to protect them. But the most unexpected part of this new chapter wasn't the work. It was the people. Slowly, almost naturally, a new circle formed around me. Cousins, old classmates, a couple of coworkers, my childhood neighbor, even a few women I met through the founder groups I supported. Every one of them carried their own story of being misunderstood, dismissed, or scapegoated by the people who were supposed to love them most. We didn't plan it, but we created our own tradition, holiday-chosen family night. Not on Christmas Day, not on Thanksgiving, but sometime between, when no one had obligations, no roles to perform, no expectations to uphold. We met at my townhouse or someone else's apartment. Everyone brought a dish that meant something to them: mac and cheese from a cousin who grew up in Georgia, kimchi pancakes from a colleague raised in Seoul, lasagna from my college roommate. We sat on the floor, we ate until we were too full. We played music. We joked about the families that shaped us and the lives we were building beyond them. No one sat at the edge of the table. No one walked on eggshells. No one was the difficult one. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And every time, I felt pieces of myself settling back into place. One evening, close to the first anniversary of our Paris trip, Grandma came over with a grocery bag of baked goods she insisted on making from scratch, even though I always told her she didn't need to. She sat comfortably in my living room, cardigan draped loosely around her shoulders, her silver hair glowing under the lamplight. I made us tea, and as we waited for it to steep, she asked in her gentle voice, "Can we watch it?" I knew exactly what she meant. We sat together on the couch, a soft throw blanket over our legs, and replayed the video we recorded in Paris, the one right before the call. In it, the Eiffel Tower sparkled behind us as I held up the trust papers with trembling hands, and Grandma rested her palm on mine. She laughed softly at her younger self on the screen. "I looked tired," she joked. "You were brave," I said. "Oh, honey," she responded, patting my knee. "I wasn't brave. You were." All I did was tell the truth. The room warmed around us. Outside, snow began to fall again in slow, quiet flakes, coating the night with silver. And in that moment, sitting beside the woman who had always seen me even when no one else did, I realized something. For the first time in my entire life, Christmas didn't feel like a bruise. It felt like a memory I could breathe through. A memory that no longer hurt. A memory that had changed everything. Later that night, after Grandma left and the snow had thickened, I stood by the window and let the final message of this entire story settle into my heart. It was a truth sharper and cleaner than anything I'd felt before. I was never the difficult daughter. I was simply the first one who refused to stay silent. And that refusal, once considered a flaw, had become the foundation of the life I was building. A life chosen. A life protected. A life defined not by who excluded me, but by who stood beside me. So, to anyone listening who has ever carried that label, I have this to say. If your whole life people called you difficult, remember, sometimes people use that word when what they really mean is, you stopped letting us walk over you. You don't need anyone's signature on your worth. You don't need your parents' approval to grow. You can build your own trust, maybe not of money, but of boundaries, of safety, of the people you choose to call family. And one day, you'll sit at a table you built yourself, surrounded by people who see you clearly, and you will realize you were never the problem. You were simply the beginning of the healing. If you've ever been the difficult one, tell me. What would you do to protect your future? And where are you listening from today? Your story matters more than you know.